We'd like to warn you that there's some graphic content ahead, which may not be suitable for all audiences.
Hey everyone, my name is Caitlyn Wininger with Herzig Engineering, and we have a special guest today. We're going to talk about his background and a really unique story that he has, Jason Brozen, and let's just dive in. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So first off, can you just give us a little background about yourself and, what your history is?
How I got here.
Yeah.
So I started off as an electrician back in around 93. I was putting in car stereos as a kid and wiring houses as a young adult, and I just thought there'd be more out there. And I wanted to get into engineering, but unfortunately my schooling wasn't great. I didn't pay attention enough and the math was just too difficult. So I kind of fell into the electrical portion and went to school for a couple of years. It was actually Johnson County Community College, kind of their pilot program for the electrical technology, and then took my master's license, electrical license, and started off doing residential, commercial, industrial electrical. And so I spent, probably 28 years as a master electrician, construction for about 35 years. So that's generally the background. I've always been, pretty technically minded, always fidgeting and taking stuff apart and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people in the trade, no matter what trade, can relate to the idea of, engineering seems like the way you design it, but actually being able to hands-on and build those things and put it together is a unique background and experience that...
Both very important.
Yes, it all works together.
Right.
Yeah, we need both. So you had a pretty unique and exciting, so to speak, in a bad way, incident that happened. You want to talk about what led up to those events, and then we can dive into the details? Yeah,
so as I spent 20 years as a service electrician, so working on, again, residential, commercial, industrial stuff, right? Troubleshooting. And so we did a lot of service projects. So one of the project I had for that day was to install a 200 amp breaker. It was about this big, about the size of a small loaf of bread, into a 2500 amp piece of electrical equipment. It's 12208. So of course, the first thing that electricians think is, it's just 120, it's no big deal. So I had to put this breaker in there, and in order to get that breaker in there, I had to cut some tape off of the bus bar. It was General Electric equipment, A-series type equipment. And when it comes from the factory, there's tape wrapped on the bus bars. So obviously you can't put a breaker on a piece of tape. So as part of my complacency, which we'll get into, I took my metal utility knife and started cutting the tape off of that energized bus bar, because that's the kind of stuff we'd done a million times before, right?
Yeah.
We've always done it that way. It's 12208, it's pretty harmless. And so a lot of times in my training, I talk about dominoes. And so everybody has a row of dominoes. And every time you make a bad decision, you flip a domino, and it makes you more complacent as you survive. So that was probably my second to the last domino. I got through that process, and then I needed to get that breaker in there. Now that process, to be clear, was pretty nerve-wracking, right? And I called my boss and said, this is precarious, we may want to shut this off. And after some discussion, I decided mainly not to shut it off. But anyway, so we got through that process. I needed to put this breaker in there. There's 3 bus bars in there, A, B, C phase. And one of the bars, the B phase, was up, and I couldn't get the breaker in because the sides of the breaker have to fit inside of that space. And so I needed to move that bus bar. Well, you can't just stick a screwdriver in there, right? I mean, that'll, so
you would think.
that would have been stupid. So I was thinking what I could move that bar with, and I thought, well, I've got a wooden carpenter's pencil, and that's got graphite, that might blow up. So I grabbed my fuse holders, right, or fuse pullers. They're plastic or fiber. They're made to go into that restricted approach boundary and pull hot fuses. Not even for 2 seconds did I think that there was a metal rivet in the end of those. So shoved those in there, giant arc flash, and it was just like that. Happened in an instant. Couldn't get away from it, and it burned me pretty substantially. So that was back in 2009, April 7th. It was cold morning. It didn't feel too bad because I was largely 3rd degree burned, and the nerves weren't working at that point. But the 2nd degree burn didn't hurt too bad because of the cool weather.
So why would you do a task like that energized? Obviously, there were some warning flags that you kind of pushed through because that's what electricians do. You get the
Sure.
job done, right? But why did you not attempt to shut it down to begin with?
Well, you know what I do when I talk about when I do my testimonial, if you will, or training, I talk a lot about complacency. And as a 10-year, at that point, I think I was in 10 years as a master electrician, and I'd seen a lot and done a lot. And I say in my training, as you've heard, that when you do an unsafe act, when you decide to break the rules, if you will, and you survive, it's like a mouse in the maze that gets the cheese, right? And they figure out a shortcut to get that cheese, and that's the way they go every time. So I'd been making those shortcuts, but also I say that as human beings, we don't keep jumping off 25-foot cliffs, right? We'll go to a 50 and then a 75 and a 100 and then a 120 and eventually die. So as a tradesman or anybody in the workforce doing anything, when you do something and there's no consequences, you believe it's totally okay. And complacency is very equal to stupidity, right? Because I wasn't ignorant of the hazards, I knew them. But you become, the definition of complacency is basically just thinking there's not a hazard there when there really is. And so lots of tasks led up to that point. Lots of really stupid decisions. After that accident, I could go back in my mind's eye and just review the film of all the times that it was a miracle that I didn't get killed at work. So I think as tradesmen, and if you look at the stats, the older the electrician or tradesperson in the field, the more likely there is to be an accident because you push that envelope.
That is true. You know, there's kind of this ebb and flow. Whenever you first go into the trade, you're more likely to have an incident because you don't know what you're working on nearly as well as those who have that experience. And so you're more likely to accidentally touch something you shouldn't have and things like that. And then it drops off for a little while and then it ebbs right back up the longer you're working and the more comfortable you get. And then it drops off right before retirement because those guys are like, I don't want to deal with that. Yeah. So it is interesting looking at those statistics, but you're right. The largest number are those who have been in it long enough that they should know better.
Yeah, and that's the ignorance and stupidity flip-flop. When you're young, you're ignorant. You don't know what you don't know. And so you're more likely to get into some sort of accident not knowing the hazards. And then as you get older, you're complacent, and then it flip-flops. You just become stupid.
Yeah,
I mean, frankly.
honestly, and you're not wrong. It's not just electricians. Well, also because there's more than just electricians doing electrical work. I mean,
Sure.
Truly. And so keeping that in mind, it's like just because you're an electrician and this is your story, it applies to anybody who's opening electrical enclosures for any reason. Even
That's
if they're a
true.
controls technician and there happens to be, you know, distribution power in the same enclosure, they also need to be aware that simple, you know, seemingly pointless tasks are going to expose them to these hazards, and they have to respect that.
Very true.
Keep that vigilance. And it is hard to do because human nature.
Sure.
We want to take those shortcuts.
Yeah.
Everywhere we go, everything we do, complacency is a problem. It's not just a tradesman thing.
True.
So making that point is very important for sure. But aside from the complacency, what other factors do you think contributed to you performing such a risky task? You know, you mentioned that there was tape on the bars and so you were trying to scrape it off and that they weren't far enough apart to even put it in. At what point do you think there were other contributing factors aside from that complacency?
So it's interesting. That's a great question because I'm with Tyndale, in case you didn't know, and so we do a video series every year called Arc Week. This season we had 3 arc flash survivors. And all 3 had one thing in common, that we weren't wearing PPE. So that was the major contributor of all of our injuries.
Yeah.
But why did it happen? So like you said, what were the other contributors? Well, the first video, the individual just wanted to get the job done. It was Friday afternoon. They had PPE and he knew the hazards, but his PPE was in another vehicle and it was Friday at 5 o'clock. I just need to get this done so I can start my weekend. And that individual paid a dear price as well. Survived, of course. Second individual was a younger guy, a 2-year apprentice. Also no PPE. Didn't even really understand PPE. Was doing a task that shouldn't be doing. In my case, again, no PPE. And then I was the complacent guy, right? So there's many factors that can affect having an accident, not just the piece of equipment, you know, such as a piece falling in that you didn't know could create an arc flash. Pulling a panel cover off, slipping, cutting a wire, something like that. The main contributor for me was the complacency aspect and thinking I was smarter than the hazard, right? Just saying, I'm good. Electricians are a cocky bunch, right? Shakespeare said your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. And, electricians, and engineers, very smart and very well trained and probably the best in the country technically, but that also can breed a level of arrogance that really feeds that complacency thing that we talk about. So that's probably some of the contributors, just wanting to get the job done.
Yeah.
Being the top guy at the company, lead guy, just getting in there, getting the job done.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest one.
Well, and I think that speaks to company culture too. Because if you are the top guy, because you got jobs done no matter what, is that really the best culture to have for a company?
No.
Probably not, right?
No.
So that brings up another interesting point in my mind, at least, that, okay, your complacency led to this, but you were in an environment that was accepted and maybe even encouraged because you were able to get the job done without an accident for so many years at that point. And so people who were overseeing you also got complacent with your safety, which is easy to happen.
Oh, yeah.
If you've got somebody that you trust and they're saying they can get the job done, by all means, right? But yeah, it's an all-around system, I think. It's not just the individual worker, although the buck stops with you, right?
Absolutely. Great. That's a fantastic point, because a lot of people have a misconception that complacency is all the individual, the technician at the job. The culture breeds complacency. So even like the conversation with the boss, right, where I said, hey, this is precarious. We might want to shut this off. And bunny trail here, sidebar, you have to turn it off unless you're shutting off a transfer switch for life safety at a hospital, or warning systems for toxic chemicals or explosive material or something. You are required to turn that off. But the conversation with my boss, where we decided, okay, I'm just going to keep going. So he was just as complacent as I was, because he was number one guy on the job. I hadn't had any injuries in the past, right? The company hadn't had any major injuries, which is a major contributor to we're doing just fine without recordables. And so it helps, it's a fertile ground for the individuals. So yes, that's a great point.
It encourages it rather than helping to correct it and keep that vigilance. Yeah. So, okay, focusing in on the arc flash event itself, that electrical explosion, so to speak. Do you remember anything specific during the event? That moment that it started to arc, is there anything that you can remember?
Yeah, everybody says accidents happen in slow-mo. You're in a car wreck and they're like, oh, it was all in slow motion. And as I've trained around the country, I have people say, oh yeah, I was in this certain accident and it's just like that. I could literally feel the pulses, slow. And that's, a 60th of a second, right? I think it went 7 cycles maybe, something like that. The accident was, it calculated, you guys calculated it for me actually, and Ryan did.
Yep.
And in 2 seconds, it was, I think, 38 calories.
Wow.
So pretty high at 2 seconds. Now, there's no way it went 2 seconds, because if it had, it would have killed me or ignited all my clothing, as you can see in the pictures. But my clothing was burned, from an explosion. It just didn't fully ignite. And so further bolstering the reason, the thing of not wearing fuel. Don't wear fuel, because it's likely to kill you, not from the explosion, but from the secondary injury. But anyway, I could feel those. I could feel those cycles, and I knew what was happening. I'm like, this is an arc flash, because I knew about arc flash. My boss, I'm blessed to have my boss Scott Margolin, who's been on YouTube. He's kind of a godfather of arc flash videos, right? And I'd been oohing and ahhing and showing people arc flash videos for years that he's done at different organizations. And so I knew the risk, right? I knew that I should have PPE. Now, I didn't have a 40 cal suit. In 2009, that was kind of a unicorn back then. They were saying you couldn't even survive a 40 cal, and there were thousands of dollars. And anyway. So I remember a lot of details about it. I got up and I thought I was on fire. And so immediately I started patting, my clothing, and then I saw a light. from a door that cracked open. The manager heard it. And the first thing I asked him was, am I on fire? Because I didn't know if I was on fire or not because of the videos.
Right.
That's the first thing that popped in my head. So I wasn't on fire, thankfully. And as I told you guys before, there's a lot of miracles that kept me alive. That's one of them.
This is an incredible thing to not only see this firsthand, but be able to tell the story about it. And to do that, you had to go through quite a lot. So can you give us a little bit of insight on what it's like to try to recover from an event like this?
Sure. Well, it all starts, I mean, the fire department was really close.
Sure.
So they showed up very quickly, like minutes. They're just a few blocks down the street. Immediately they start working on me, and they had this sense of urgency, and I remember thinking, that's kind of odd, because I think I'm okay. Right, I thought maybe I'd be off work for a month or something like that. And I'm sure obviously there's a level of shock there, but so they had this sense of urgency, and I didn't get that until later, when I was able to speak to them. But then from there, it's in the ambulance, and then you could hear them discussing about, hey, which hospital should we take him to? Because there's hospitals that specialize in burns, and the decision was made to take me to the KU Med Center because they have a great burn center there. And so that's where I started the journey, and just with the doctors trying to cut, my wedding ring off, cut clothing off of me so they could see the extent of the damage. And then they put me out, and I was in a coma for a week. They put you in a coma, they scrub all the burnt skin off you, which is, debridement, and you're usually out for that process. A lot of people talk about being awake for that, but I think with serious burns like that, they want to put you out to stabilize your breathing and see where you're at. So the recovery process, the hospital was 2 weeks in ICU. So the first week was in a coma with hand surgery, rebuilding the backs of my hands, so it's skin off my legs. And then they woke me up, and then immediately it begins the therapy and moving and trimming dead skin that didn't stick and all that kind of stuff. And then 5 months of intense hand therapy, 7 months off work. I rushed back at 7 months. The doctor finally released me, but I was at work with compression gloves doing work again.
Sure. So you mentioned that your hands got probably the majority of that injury, right? And then they had to use your thighs for the skin grafts. Were any other parts of you injured during the
Yeah,
OPOC?
hands and face.
Sure,
I had a deep second degree on my face with some pieces of third degree spots, and then largely a deep second degree on the backs of my hands, third degree on the backs, second degree on my palms, that required the skin grafts. Second degree burns can heal generally.
Sure.
Third degree burns will not heal on their own without some help. So that's why they take the skin off my legs. And that, by the way, was more painful than my hands.
Really?
Yeah, when they take, I don't know what it is, because they shave the skin off a real thin layer down to the nerve endings.
Oh.
And man, it was way more painful, albeit temporary, but it was terrible. I mean, I couldn't even walk. It was just brutal.
Right. I mean, it saved your hands, obviously.
Right.
But
It did.
that would be a horrible experience to have to go through. And then
For sure.
on the other side, I'm thinking about, you mentioned that they had to cut off your wedding ring. So what did your wife and family think about all this?
So my kids were 4 and 6 at the time.
Okay.
So my son and daughter, really, they didn't understand. They just knew Dad wasn't home, right? Where's Dad? He's hurt, But when my wife showed up to the hospital, and my parents and everybody, what's the first question that people ask?
What happened?
Is it going to be okay?
Oh,
What happened? Is it going to
Yeah.
be okay, right? And the doctor said, we don't know, right? The doctors, they didn't know. They put me in a coma. It's interesting with arc flash injuries, they have to see how much damage is done to your lungs, right? Because there's people that have these catastrophic injuries and survive, and you can't believe it. And then there's people that have these minor injuries and die, right, in the hospital. So with the lung damage, with that superheated air, because I'm sure most of the audience has Googled arc flash and knows ad nauseum the details of arc flash, but that 35,000 degree air can get in your lungs and smoke your lungs instantly. You can't heal from that, right? So they just don't know if even at full oxygen, if your pulse ox drops out, you're going to perish.
Sure.
So the stress, right? At the time, my spouse was a stay-at-home spouse with 2 little kids. I was a sole provider. parents. I'm an only child, right? So you can imagine the amount of stress and despair that these types of injuries cause. Even if your spouse works, even if you've got 10 brothers and sisters, it's going to cause massive stress, right? Massive.
Absolutely. Having somebody that you care about in the hospital and the doctor saying, we'll see, there's nothing comforting about that, for sure.
No confidence.
It doesn't matter what it was, but even in these situations where there is so much follow-up and so long that you have to wait to see, it's not just wait to see that if they wake up after this, surgery, wait to see this, it's months, and then you could still have complications. So these events are incredible. So I'm really glad that you're here to talk about it today.
Me too.
I bet your family is too.
Yeah, I'm sure it was terrifying.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And in the beginning, the first couple of days they didn't let anybody in. 3 days later, you had to mask, gown, hairnet, the whole. You had to go in like you were doing surgery. So I'm sure that was terrifying to them.
Oh my gosh, yeah, definitely. So it did take a long time. You said how many months before you were?
So 5 months of hand therapy.
Sure.
2 weeks for me to get out of the hospital.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean, hey, 2 weeks, I was great. In 2 weeks, I got home. Mm-hmm. And then you're dependent. Like, I had no use of my hands. I could barely move. I couldn't move my hands at all. After they took all the staples out, I could move my hands about like this. Now, also to be clear, hands and face are the most common injury.
Sure.
I post a lot on LinkedIn, as you guys see.
Yep.
And weekly or bi-weekly, there's an arc flash accident, and when they report the details correctly, it's always hands and face, right? Because if they're not wearing fuel, a lot of times people will take their gloves off. I can't work in these PPE gloves, and I can't see in this older green mask or whatever it is, and they take this stuff off and they have an explosion, an arc flash. Their clothes don't ignite, but their hands are right there in it, and so is their face. So most common injury. So anyway, you get home and it's recovery, right? It's people coming to your house for therapy because you can't get out. People have to drive you to your doctor's appointments. People have to take you to your therapy appointments, have to make sure that you're getting your meds administered properly so you don't get addicted to pain meds. And they have to button your shirts and your pants, and they have to wipe your butt, right? You have no use of your hands as an individual. Which I can tell you as the individual is also terrifying. As a tradesman who has worked with my hands my entire career, now I don't have the use of my hands, and I'm consumed with the thought of, am I ever going to be able to use my hands again, right? It is a mental, emotional, physical assault on all levels when you have an arc flash. So that recovery process, once I could start going to hand therapy, I could get out of the house and drive, and there was 5 months of that. And then I could go back to work at 7 months. But I'm going to say probably 2 years. I still have lots of scar tissue that it limits movement.
Sure.
I'm not going to Texas and picking up big mason jars of iced tea. I can't get my hand wrapped around it.
Okay.
Right? So I can my left hand. Some of my fingernails got blown off and damaged. So I'm so cheap. If I see a quarter on the ground, I'm going to pick it up. Well, I can't pick it up with my left hand because my nails don't come out far enough. And strangely enough, your nails are there to help you pick things up. So if you don't have your nails and they don't come out to the end, you can't pick anything up. It doesn't work. So it's no small parts with my left hand with my main finger. So it's a pain.
Right.
So you live with, obviously you adapt. Just my caseworker was a quadriplegic. Still had enough use of his arms that he could drive. So the adaptation's amazing with human body, what you can do.
Sure.
But thankfully this, probably 95%.
So a couple years later, you started to have a somewhat normal day-to-day life, but
Sure.
it's never gone back to what it was before.
No, I still can't feel heat and cold on my hands, and there's still some stiffness there, and
Sure.
aches and pains, and it's going to build arthritis too as I get older because it's harder to move because of the scar tissue. So you're never going to recover fully. It's an absolute miracle and a blessing that I have as much use of my hands. I personally know people that don't, right? Sure. That lose fingers, that are very limited, can't move, or their fingers, you get that where your fingers bend, because the scar tissue and tendons, shrink up and all that.
Right. So, this was a major incident, and this was the one that you were forced to slow down and really appreciate the fact that this is incredibly hazardous stuff. Were you ever injured before that? And, what was your thought process before this big arc flash event?
So there's a couple, stupid day-to-day, like dumb injuries that we all have in this construction industry where you might cut yourself if you slip or something and get a couple stitches or something like that. And again, every time you survive something, you just become invincible in your own mind. But no, I wasn't. I was very careful. I wasn't an accident. There's a lot of workers out there that don't pay attention.
Yeah.
I didn't struggle from that. I did have some minor stuff, but nothing ever major. But
Sure.
I was very, I'm not going to say contemplative. I kind of rushed through some stuff, but definitely was aware of my surroundings and tried to be careful. I would probably have been considered one of the safer guys at that job.
Sure. And that's always interesting because it just takes the one time.
That's it.
You can be the safest guy on the job site, and then you take it for granted one time. Right?
And it could be not your fault.
True.
So that's another fantastic point, is that one of the things I hear out there in the industry is, I'll walk sites and talk to employees, and I'll ask them, hey, what PPE, do you guys wear? Where's your PPE stash? Oh, we lock everything out. We don't work anything hot. And you train, so you're very familiar with that. And that's not a true statement. It's all hot work until you know it's not by verifying. But a lot of times they don't have the right PPE out there. And another thing is they say to themselves, I don't need PPE, I'm just going to. And so I'm just going to pull this panel cover off to see what kind of breakers are in here so that I can see what kind of breakers to order some parts. And I don't need PPE. I'm not really doing any hot work. I'm not touching anything. I may not even be within that 12-inch restricted approach boundary, so I don't need PPE. They pull that cover off and something falls in and it blows up, and now they're on fire head to toe because they don't have daily wear PPE, or they weren't wearing the correct PPE when they did that task. So you can get hurt from someone else's mistakes. It's not as common, but certainly that can happen.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Our field techs, they're electricians, master electricians, been on the job for 20 some years, came to work for Herzig because they realized that working on the side of safety is usually better.
Always.
Oftentimes they come after having an arc flash event of their own or some other major event that they said, I want to change my focus to helping other people. And so they help with collecting the data. So they're going in. They're incredibly safety-minded people, but they're going into facilities that they have no clue what's behind those covers. And so absolutely, always wearing their suits all the time, because there's just no point risking it. Just taking the cover off has caused events before, as you just mentioned.
Absolutely.
So having that PPE before you open it is really it's their last resort, I should say. It's not your only cause of protection, but it is your last resort. That's their last line of defense.
Yeah, for me it's a 70B too, which you are well familiar with. Your guys are out there. I don't even like pulling panel covers, right? Because we both know 70B and most of the facilities you go in are not properly maintained. And you get into that 110.2 and there where it talks about all those conditions of normal operation. Nobody, with the exception of maybe a data center, can hit those points, right? And so your guys are pulling those covers. You don't know. Or operating breakers, you don't know. You just don't know.
Can't take anything for granted. Not in this field. Definitely not. So how has that experience impacted the way that you make decisions today?
So it's interesting. I went back to doing what I was doing before.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, it scares a lot of guys out of the field.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going to say that the hair on the back of my neck didn't stand up a lot when I was pulling covers. And I wore PPE most of the time, surprisingly, which I can think back and go, you idiot, right? Of all people.
Right.
So even people that have accidents, still, you're like, nah, this is harmless. You got to stay vigilant. But I went back to doing what I was doing. As a matter of fact, the same hotel that I was injured at, like 3 years later, called us, the company I worked for, again, and said, hey, we've got something buzzing in our main gear. Could you come out and take a look at it? And I got that call. So I walked into the same exact electrical room with that same exact electrical gear. And it turned out it was just in the metering section was a CT, a wire come loose. It was a CT, buzzing current transformer. And we could take care of it, safely. But it was a little freaky.
Yeah.
Because, and let me just expand on that, when you have an arc flash accident, really any accident, you will suffer, most everyone, from ASD, acute stress disorder. So for like a month or two, you're gonna be a little freaked out, and maybe you have some bad dreams and feel anxious, and when you think about your accident. And that's especially true for arc flash. And I suffered through that for about a month. But then I moved out of that. I didn't suffer anymore. But sometimes, and I have great examples of this, you go from acute stress disorder to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and that can last a lifetime. And thankfully, I didn't suffer from that. So I was able to do those things. But some people can't go back to doing what they were doing. They have to get out of that entire job track, which is not an easy job. If you're a master electrician or an electrical engineer, you're restarting your life. It's not just a simple little pivot.
Yeah, you've already dedicated so much to your education and training and learning
Right.
and developing that trying to pivot careers, although completely understandable, would be massively difficult.
Massive. And largely not possible for, somebody that's 50 and older or whatever that has an accident, right? It's going to be very difficult.
So when you were on the job and going through your day-to-day life, did you ever think back to any training that you had been provided, or did you have electrical safety training?
No, that's just such an important point, is that part of that complacency that we talked about is, our guys know what they're doing. Why do we need training? We haven't had any accidents. And so there was no training. Like there was zero training. We kind of talked about some stuff, and people kind of threw out, hey, well, shouldn't we do this or shouldn't we do that? And we just didn't, right? And so it's crucial to have those pre-job planning meetings, toolbox talks, the tailgate meetings, in our world, in the training, the risk assessments, with somebody signing something off when you're doing energized work, if you're even allowed to do energized work. And there just wasn't any of that.
I gotcha. Well, okay, so if you did have electrical safety training, what kind of person would you have wanted to have that teaching you?
Somebody like me or you.
Yeah.
For sure. And I don't say that arrogantly,
Sure.
but the reality is there's one thing I love about Herzig too, is to back up, is that your guys are master electricians, right? That makes a huge difference, right? Because people aren't stupid that are opening panels, but they are ignorant of the hazards, right? And as we've talked about before, data collection is the foundation of a proper study. If the data collection is flawed, you're not getting garbage in, garbage out, right? And so a master electrician or a journeyman electrician, somebody that has experience, or an electrical engineer that knows what they're looking at, those people can see things and understand and know PPE and all that stuff. The people that we train don't have that. There are a lot of maintenance personnel, could be beginning engineers that are working on things but don't typically work on a bunch of electrical, could be DC, whatever. So training is key, right? By somebody like you or myself that has the qualifications and experience, if you will. The CESCP is, to me, I don't think anybody should be training electrical safety without that.
Sure.
Right? That's my opinion. There are people that are qualified, obviously, to teach that, but I think that's a great foundation that says, okay, number one, you have the hours and the experience to know what the product that you're giving somebody is correct.
That's a very good point. You mentioned a licensed electrician or journeyman or master electrician, either one, or an engineer, but doesn't matter which one you are, unless you have that experience. You have some understanding of what you're looking at and knowing not to take things for granted. It's not always going to be installed the way it's supposed to be, right?
Sure.
That's another thing that you have to think about, is just being able to apply the theoretical knowledge to what happens in the real world requires experience and that time
Absolutely.
to learn. For the electrical accident that you had, that arc flash, you didn't have the arc flash rating for that equipment, right? So it wasn't labeled already. We talked earlier about the fact that we had done kind of a cursory review of what it might have been, but you didn't have that information at the time. Do you think that would have been beneficial?
Oh, without a doubt. I don't think that you can do your job as an electrician or maintenance or even operate machinery, because non-electricians are allowed to operate machinery if they're exposed to parts as long as they've had training. But you do not know what PPE to put on.
Yeah.
Right? You have to have that sticker to tell you calorie rating. You need to know what PPE to wear to keep yourself safe. Otherwise, you have no idea. It's a guess. And largely, you see that in the industry. The bigger the equipment, the bigger the suit, right? And that doesn't corroborate,
No.
right? You can have a small branch panel that has a massive incident energy because it takes longer to trip out. And you can have a huge piece of gear, a 3,000 amp service, that's at 2 calories because of the trip rating of the breaker, the time. So you can't just go, okay, it's 480 and it's a big service. So no, I know I need to put on 40 cal suit. And this is a 120, 208, 400 amp panel, so I should be cool with just a shirt and pants.
You are absolutely right. I cannot tell you the number of times that I've gone on site to give trainings or an audit, or even just to help with the data collection or the label app or whatever we're doing for their system, their study, their facility. And everybody seems to be surprised whenever smaller panels end up having pretty high ratings sometimes. And they're like, oh, we get into this all the time. I guess that was a good thing it never blew on us. I'm like, yeah. You can't just assume because the size is smaller or the amperage rating is a little bit smaller that it's not going to be as bad of a arc flash event. Right. And the voltage level is not the only factor.
It's true.
That is not going to tell you how bad an arc flash is. People commonly think that.
Right.
480 volts is the one we have to worry about.
And then another thing we see, without a label, you don't know when to put on PPE, right? So let's say you want to put on PPE. Your company is actually called a company like Tyndale and purchased PPE for you, and you want to wear it. When do you put it on? How close to that piece of equipment before you need to put on that PPE, right? So those labels, there's several things that labels have to have. You need to know what voltage you're working on so you can put the right gloves on if you're in that, restricted approach boundary. But you need to have arc flash, gear on within that arc flash boundary. You have no idea what that is.
Right.
So it could be small. I've seen arc flash boundaries up to 60 some feet.
It's incredible, yeah.
That's huge, right? And to be clear, that arc flash boundary is where you're going to get a 2nd degree burn if you don't have PPE. Anything within that, you could die very easily from a burn injury.
Right. And that goes to also, let's say we have this incredible worker that's very knowledgeable and safety oriented. They've got their PPE on, they're opening stuff up. But those boundaries are very important, not just because you're entering that boundary and you need that PPE, but how far back do people need to stay? And you're right, you don't know that until a study has been completed.
No clue. You could kill somebody else.
Yeah.
You could be in a 40 cal suit because you think the equipment needs a 40 cal suit, and it may. And then you could have a production worker working near you on a assembly line, and you blow this piece of equipment up and you kill that individual because their clothing ignites and yours doesn't. You may go to the hospital with 2nd degree burns if your PPE is not adequate, but this person may perish from those injuries.
Right.
Labels are, I didn't know until I, worked for a company that did labels, how important labels were. Mm-hmm. I didn't really understand until I worked with Tyndale how important not wearing fuel is. Now, I knew it was important here,
Sure.
kind of, but man, it is so important to have those labels to tell you what to put on, right? And how far to be away.
Right. And we kind of touched on it already, but just because you have a study doesn't mean it's good either.
It's true.
You said garbage in, garbage out,
True.
right? So how important is it to have qualified people through the whole process, not just data collection, not just the entry of the data, the review, the signing off, to even worry about having a licensed engineer, all the aspects of it. What's your impression on those studies?
It's paramount that you have qualified people on the job that give you your data collection, that understand all the stuff we've talked about as far as boundaries and how to protect everyone around there while they're doing data collection. But then you bring that study in, and it has to be reviewed by a qualified engineer. I know Bob Herzig is kind of a legend in Kansas City and in the arc flash industry, right? I mean, he's since 2000.
Yep.
He's kind of really been a pioneer in that field, right? And he's a 50 stater, right?
Yep.
And that's impressive, right? And so that's quality, right? That's qualified. Another great friend of mine is also a 50 stater, who stamps studies. I think that you could have an individual doing data collection that is fantastic, but still makes mistakes.
Sure.
Right? Everybody makes mistakes. I've put thousands and thousands of stickers on equipment, labels, and you find mistakes, right? Nobody's perfect. I don't care how qualified you are. It is always good to have a peer review, to have somebody verify. You get what you inspect, not what you expect, right? Famous saying from my old boss. I love it because it's true.
Okay.
So if you can have somebody, a qualified EE review your studies and stamp those, absolutely. I think it's paramount. I don't think that you can do it and actually give out a quality product without doing that.
And that speaks to the organization's culture a little bit too. Are they willing to put out any information that may or may not be adequate for the person's safety, for goodness sake? So do you think a company's culture as a whole and deciding who can do these analysis is important?
I think in general, culture is super important. Like, for instance, when I interviewed for Tyndale a few months back, everybody told me how great the culture was. And you always hear that, right? Everybody goes, oh, we have such a great culture.
It's a key word now.
But it's crazy good, right? Yeah. It's like unlike any other culture I've been in. And so I'm from Kansas City, Herzig's in Kansas City, right? And so, I'm familiar with the company, and they have a great culture, right? And it's not just like the pats on the backs or, yeah, we love you and appreciate you. It's really, do we care about our employees to keep them safe? Do we care about our customers to keep them safe? It's really, there's a lot of things to culture. And I think, it's really important for a company to not just have a culture of safety, but to understand. They understand it in their head, but maybe not in their heart, that, hey, what you're doing is saving lives, like literally from, the video production lady that's helping us out, right? I mean, she is in here, but she's helping to save lives, right? Putting this material out, it all is super important. And once you have a culture that understands, I think that really can change a lot of hearts and minds.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So just out of curiosity, this is the third time that we've had you at the Herzig Engineering office now, and we're so grateful to have you here again giving this interview. A couple months back, you also gave a nice presentation to our electricians to, kind of preach to the choir a little bit, but it's good to hear other perspectives and other stories to have a more well-rounded understanding of this hazard, right? Did you hear about Herzig Engineering before we started contacting you directly?
Yeah, it's funny. I think I applied for a job here like
oh, really?
7 or 8 years ago, and I didn't make the cut for some reason.
Oh, no.
And but like I said, since 2000, the name's been out there. Yeah. And I was an arrogant, cocky, 20-year-old at that point, or 30-year-old actually. Can do math. Told you I wasn't good at math. And so the name has been in the industry. It's a great name in the industry. So I was familiar with Herzig and what you guys did, but it was always up here for me. I was just the electrician, and this is the group of electrical engineers that do this stuff. And so I had heard of Herzig before, and it's been a pleasant experience hanging out with you guys because you do share the same mission, vision, passion that I have. That's just ultra dear to my heart, to save workers' lives. Right? It is important. You guys do have that passion. And I respect that a ton, right? And I know Mr. Herzig has the same heart, to keep people safe out there, and that's why he's done this for so long.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like from your experience at Tyndale, the same can be said. I have a little bit newer understanding of Tyndale. I've been following like the ARC Weeks for the last few years and things like that. But whenever we went through and updated our training content, I found the Tyndale arc flash test videos, and I reached out and I was like, hey, can I put these in our training? You know, they're newer, they're better explained. Is there any possibility?
Sure.
And they're like, yeah, absolutely, go for it. And that immediately told me a little bit of that culture piece, is that they were willing to let us use their test videos in our training, which is incredible to see that collaboration.
We have the largest library of technical resources of anybody. And so one of the reasons I made the jump, I mean, I liked where I was at. I loved what I was doing. I was training full time, 70E training. But there's just so much more technical out there that you can put out. And they put out so many technical resources. Like I said, Scott Margolin is my boss. And I mean, he's a mad scientist when it comes to fibers and clothing and the whole history of PPE. Most companies that sell apparel don't really get that. And Tyndale sells all brands, right? We love and understand our partners and what they sell, and it is a very strong mission, vision, passion from the ownership all the way down, from the time it was started to now, to protect workers. I mean, we outfit 95% of the investor-owned utilities in the country right now,
wow,
which is pretty impressive, and that says a lot for the company that we have that trust. You know, kind of like Herzig has that trust in the industry that you're going to do it right.
Yeah, that's an important thing to have. Yeah.
Oh, without a doubt. Reputation's paramount.
Yeah. So you have essentially, from my perspective, made it your life's mission to talk about your incident. It wasn't your greatest moment, but you're constantly sharing it. Can you give us some insight on why that's so important to you?
Yeah, I would almost say it was my greatest moment and my worst moment, right? It's kind of like your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. It's kind of that whole thing. If nothing, it was a defining moment, right? It defined my mission, my vision, and my passion for the rest of my life. Now, most people go through life not really understanding their purpose, right? They go to work every day and they make widgets, and we need them to go to work and make widgets because we all use widgets.
Oh yeah.
But they don't go home on the weekend and they go, man, I love widgets. I'm so glad I make widgets every day. I've got a unique opportunity that I survived an arc flash accident while having an immense amount of electrical experience. And on top of the actual employer I had, I got an immense amount of experience at that job. And then focus that on a CESCP and training and all that stuff. I have a really unique opportunity to speak into people's lives, right? And like I said before, I believe that God saved my life because someone out there has got something really important to do. Maybe I could be part of saving their lives, right? Even if it's just one person that's going to go on to do great things. So it's unique for me in the fact that I love and believe and know, I know here and I know here, that what I'm doing is saving lives and changing things, right? I run into people years later that say, man, I work a lot safer after you did your thing. And it's great. That's the best thing I could ever hope for. So I tell a lot of people about it because I think you should. There's a lot of arc flash victims that don't share their story because it's scary for them, like the PTSD thing, or it's embarrassing, or their company said, I don't want you talking about that. But I think that you should share your experiences to help people be better. Even though it was my stupid mistake, and it was, I can use that for good, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And some of the most empowering and impactful trainings include a personal element to it. You can talk about what the books say to do all day. You can talk about what goes into an analysis and how and at what point you need to get it updated because it no longer is valid. And you can go through all those things, but without really driving home to the root of why. What are we talking about here? Your life, my life.
Right.
Billy Bob's life that you're standing next to as he's the one doing the work, whatever. It's lives. Mm-hmm. It's not just compliance. It's not just doing things to check a box.
It's true.
By any means.
People won't listen if they don't think you care.
Yeah.
If you're just a talking head up there and it's going to be like the Peanuts teacher, the wah. And a lot of people I've trained are like this, and they know they're going to give you a few minutes to see if you know what you're talking about. There's some pretty rough, rough guys, electricians, and in general and maintenance staff, you're gonna come in and you're gonna start at, you don't know what the heck you're talking about in their mind. And you got to work your way up to that. So again, it's good when you have experience in training and you have that experience in hours and you understand, or you're an engineer, you're a master electrician, whatever. People, that just gives you a leg in to then get into their hearts. And then they see what happened to me and so many other people in our examples that they say, hey, this guy does care. Because I don't want to see anybody go through what I went through. And it's so preventable.
Right.
It's completely preventable. This is something you can prevent with an engineered study that you do and the PPE that I do, right? You can eliminate this hazard.
Yeah.
It's going to take some legislative changes and some things like that, but it can happen. And I think it's going to happen very soon.
Yeah. At an organizational level, people need to, and they're starting to, but they need to do more in investing in safety. Because, looking at the dollar amounts, even if we want to take the human factor out of, which I hate doing, but it's a reality for some people out there. They want to look at the dollar amounts.
Very true.
One accident like this is way more going to impact your bottom line than just doing the things that you should have been doing to keep people safe, right?
It's very true.
So anyway, that's not the important part of it, but it is an interesting factor that I've come across, that's the pushback, and
you see a lot of EHS that they're worried. Of course, they have to be worried about the bottom line.
Of course, but
they have corporate people breathing on them. And you look at my accident, it was only a 14% burn.
Yeah.
So small, relatively small for an arc flash injury. With everything in there, monetarily, it was about $1.2 million.
Wow. Yeah.
Was the bottom line. That's with everything included. And it was a small accident, right? That's small. If someone dies at work or several people get injured, you're talking millions. And it isn't just that. It's loss of trust in the industry. It's loss of future business. It's loss of workers, production workers, and the ones that might quit because of that. It's loss of equipment. And it's downtime. If you're popping out widgets at $1 million a minute and you can't afford to go down, now you're down. There's just so many expenses that are attached to this that people don't think about.
And the greatest one being the effect on the people involved.
It's true.
Absolutely. So if you could summarize your experience here with maybe 3 main takeaways, 3 lessons learned that you would hope other people would follow and avoid themselves, not have to learn by themselves, right? What would that be?
So I think after knowing what I know now, the number one thing is to have an electrical safety plan.
Yes.
An ESP. Now the 70B just came out, as a standard, and now you're going to have an electrical maintenance plan. But when you have an accident on site, let's say you have an electrical accident, OSHA is going to come on site, and the first thing they're going to ask you is to see your ESP, right? Because whatever they do is going to be based on whatever you did or did not do in your electrical safety program.
Sure.
Right? Because they don't care what you say, they care what you document. It's got to be documented. And so if you're a company that doesn't have an electrical safety program, you are putting yourself at great risk monetarily and then with your employee, harm as far as, injury or death. So that's super important.
Well, yeah, with those events, if you can document at least that you had a program and you trained over it, because oftentimes that's the issue, that's the gap that I go in with. They have a program, but when I talk to the workers, they're like, oh, we do? I didn't realize that. Never seen it, never heard of it. Didn't realize it was a thing. So have the program, train over it, and retrain as needed. As long as they do that,
Sure.
Then it really does boil down to that worker chose to act unsafe. And that is a whole different issue. That's
Right.
a whole different complacency and culture issue. But at least getting your check boxes in order can go a long way to helping prevent these injuries
Right.
and protecting people.
And we think exactly alike, because that was my second point.
Oh, really?
Absolutely, because if you don't have a training, how are they going to know?
Yeah.
Then you keep your workforce ignorant of the hazards, of the rules, the policies, procedures, and the purpose behind them, the why. People need to understand the why, or they're just going to go, this is stupid, why are we doing that? And I've seen that, that's rampant, in the industries. So training is paramount, like you said. If you don't know what you don't know. So and you're required to do it every 3 years because of course the 70 comes out every 3 years, and then the stickers every 5 years because the IEEE, the 1584. So yeah, training is key. You have to have training. Probably the last thing I'd say, which is more on the molecular structure there at the atomic level, is the individual.
Okay.
You have to understand as an individual, there's nobody more important in your safety than you. There is nobody more important. It is not your boss's responsibility. It's not your boss's boss. It's not the EHS manager at the corporate level. It's not the owner of the company's responsibility. Now, don't get me wrong. There's clear responsibilities for all those people. But when it comes down to the final atom there, you have the choice to make a decision that's right or wrong. You have to make the right decision. You cannot be bullied. You cannot be pressured or become complacent in your own safety. You have to make those good decisions. Seek out the rules and procedures on what to wear. Now, you've got to have stickers. That kind of is up here. But if you don't have a sticker and nobody's taught you the tables method in the 70E, or you don't even know what the 70E is, you have every reasonable right to say, I'm not going to open that panel.
Right.
Every right and responsibility. Mm-hmm. Or if you see somebody doing something, you have every right and responsibility to say something. You see something, you say something.
Right.
So super important. Don't become complacent. Don't be me. My video thing with Arc Week is don't be me, right? Don't be that guy, right? That thinks you know everything, that's smarter than the hazard. I've done this a million times. I don't need PPE because I'm just going to do this. Don't be me, right? That's the third thing.
No, that makes perfect sense. Honestly, if you look at the impact somebody has by working safe versus unsafe, it's not just them. As you were talking, I thought of something else. It's not just whether you do it safely for yourself, but it's also for other people around you. Whenever you see something that's going wrong and you don't say anything, you've just reinforced to them that it's okay to act that way, to behave that way.
Right.
And, for those who are more seasoned workers, mentoring new employees, oh, don't do this, but I have experience, so I'll take the shortcut, you do it the right way. I've seen that, and it doesn't make sense because the person that's training them is taking the shortcuts, and so they think, well, that's what I want to get to, rather than seeing the person training them doing it the right way every time, and they think that is the only way that I should be doing this work.
It's true. Yeah, I tell people if you see a HVAC technician standing on top of a 6-foot ladder or an 8-foot ladder or something, and you think to yourself, that guy's stupid. You're not supposed to stand on top of a ladder. Now, I can tell you I've stood on the top of a million ladders, and most people have,
sure,
that are probably hearing this. But if you're in a place and you see that, you should say something, right? Because later, if that individual falls off that ladder and dies, unless you're heartless, you're going to go, man, I should have said something.
Right.
Why didn't I say something to that person? Right? Or and before you say too, that you're doing something, this is pretty safe. I saw on OSHA the other day, I'm reviewing arc flash injuries. I saw my identical arc flash on there. It was another technician. He used a screwdriver to scrape the tape off.
Oh my gosh.
Instead of a utility knife. But other than that, no difference. That individual died from his injuries, right? Later in the hospital, a week later, because it was about a 35-40% burn. So, those young technicians, the old technicians make it sound like, we always do it this way and nobody ever gets hurt doing this. Somebody got killed doing the exact same thing I was doing, right? Which was pretty shocking, really. No pun intended.
Right.
But there's a task. There's a death or injury on OSHA's website for every task that you're going to do. I promise you. You got to think about what you're doing and follow the rules.
I think that is the key lesson to be learned here. So thank you so much for your time, Jason. We really appreciate it. And again, your story is impactful and incredible, and I'm very glad that you're so open and willing to share it.
Yeah.
And we'll look forward to cooperating with you again sometime soon.
I am honored to be here, and thanks for giving me the chance.
Perfect.
Thanks.